without much further ado, and enough of my blethering, a warm welcome to Professor Charlotte Pearson and Dr. Jane Cullingworth. I don't know which one of you wants to go first, but I will turn off my camera and disappear, and you should just be the two of you on the screen. We'll
okay, thanks very much, Scott. I'll just share my screen with everyone. Okay, hopefully you see the slides now. Okay, well, thank you very much for all of you for coming along. It's really nice to see the number ticking up at the top of the screen. For those of you who came in December, this will be kind of the full fat version of what we said, with the kind of bells and whistles of the research. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk to you a bit about our research that we've been doing over the last 3 years. The project just came to a close last month, and Scott and the Scottish Transitions Forum were very much a part of our work and have been, you know, huge supports and allies to us all the way through. So what we'll do is just to go through some of the finding here. So I'm just going to introduce some of the themes to start with, and then Jane will talk a bit more about the actual research and the voices of the young people and parents we spoke to. Okay, so just a bit more about the research. If you use that, if you're interested, the QR code there will take you to our website for the project, which gives a lot more detail, including policy briefings and summary findings as well, documents that we put together, which are quite nice resources if any of you are interested in looking at them in a bit more detail. It isn't just Jane and I should also reference Janice McLaughlin in Newcastle and Tracy Shildrick and Nick Watson, our colleague here at Glasgow, and also Ned Coleman Fountain from York University. So it's been very much a collaborative affair, and importantly, when we framed the research, we wanted to do a comparative piece between England and Scotland to see what's happening in the two nations, and really getting the voices of the young disabled people and their transition experiences. Obviously hearing the different voices, but also looking at the different legislation available in each country. So a bit more about the study. Again, there's much more detail on this on the website if you're interested, but we basically interviewed about 135 people over the 3-year period, and critically this involved some longitudinal work. So we spoke to some young disabled people at the beginning and then 18 months later. So we had 33 people, young people took part in the second interviews, and we sort of covered a whole range of impairments, disabilities and needs. And we also talked to family members as well, and also third sector, statutory providers, and anyone really interested and working in the field of transitions. So that took us up to 135 interviews, so quite a substantive piece of work. Just a bit more about the study. Again, underpinning our work was to have an advisory group, and we developed this with the group called themselves the Voice of Lived Experience, the VOLE Network, together with key organisations, Scottish Transitions Forum and Glasgow Disability Alliance in Scotland, with the kind of key members. And the VOLE group and this advisory group of the young people kind of centered our research really, and kind of were our sounding boards throughout. We ran by questions, approaches, our analysis, really kind of keeping in touch with them throughout the project, so that their roles have been really critical in making sure that we get things right and accessible, interesting and kind of relevant to the young people we spoke to. So we used the age group 16 to 29 to try and cover the whole range of the transition experience. So from just leaving school right throughout 20s, as you know, obviously transitions experiences for any young person is not a kind of a single file through your 20s. It encompasses a range of stops and starts and different experiences. So we tried to capture that. And as I said, we interviewed twice over an 18-month period, using interview techniques, but also creative methods. So some of our young people used different approaches, artwork, creative writing, a range of different approaches to tell us about their experiences and their life sort of changes. And as I said, a bit more detail as well there about who we interviewed, family members of young people, the statutory and third sector providers, and then the kind of locations, really try to encompass the range of experiences, in this case in Scotland, but also across the northeast of England as well. So some of the people we spoke to were still in education or training or volunteering, and others were actively seeking employment. But where the small minority were in employment, there were a very even smaller number that had what you would call stable and secure employment, which again kind of illustrates some of the issues that we'll talk about today. So as I said, it was really important to have young disabled people keeping us right really in the research process and making sure that our work was of relevance to them. So just to include a couple of quotes here from our participants, who I really hope and I think enjoyed the process and they got something out of it as well. So one of our participants said, I had a great time. I've had fun being able to be in a project like this, to be part of it. It's helped me put into words and unpack a few things. Because I'm disabled all the time, because I'm disabled, I don't always think of the specifics about it. I just do it. So having this, it made me feel like not only can I make things clear to myself, but hopefully I can help other people understand and maybe draw their own comparisons, or even just other disabled people. And then one of our VOLE Network members told us that the project has been a real highlight of the last 3 years, and that's a testament to the care and compassion with the researcher who led the VOLE Network and the project. There's so much to change to be made to create a disability inclusive world, and having the chance to engage with the researchers and participants involved in disability youth transitions, I know will happen in time. So hopefully, as I said, a meaningful and an important experience for them to take part in this work. Okay, so to start off with, I suppose we come through from a position is looking at kind of how policy has framed and set out transitions policies, and I would definitely talk about this in terms of a failure of transitions policies. And this isn't just a kind of an attack on Scotland or England. This is a problem across countries in the Western Hemisphere, who really haven't recognised the needs of disabled young people across OECD countries. And we've seen very fragmented policy responses, hostile learning environments through the schools, which won't be a surprise to anyone on this call, limited opportunities for positive future engagement with work, and also a policy prioritisation on the other hand, which seems to focus much more on development of individual skills in a kind of increasingly competitive and restricted employment market. So a real mismatch between trying to get young disabled people engaged and part of the labour market, but not actually providing a policy framework that helps that happen. So just to think about some of the policy trends around this, just to kind of position where we are. So as I said, this isn't just an English problem or a Scottish problem. Both countries really have got work to do on transitions policy. And I would say that both countries are shifted towards individualised planning in the last decade. So what I mean about that, say for example, in social care, we see policies like personalisation, self-directed support in Scotland in place. So really you're having to look at individual needs rather than having a kind of broader collective support. And there are obviously positives related to that, but equally it can make people feel very isolated and unsupported in their needs as well. Government's really concerned about the Disability Employment Act. That's been pretty stubborn, around sort of 37% versus sort of 57%, that kind of 60-40 split over the last decade. It hasn't really moved, and all governments are increasingly frustrated around that. They're trying to move disabled people into the labour market. And they're particularly poor for specific impairment groups. So if you have a learning disability or complex needs, neurodiversity or mental ill health, that figure comes down significantly less as well. And in that context as well, we've actually had 30 years or over 30 years of disability discrimination legislation, which is supposed to stop or supposed to curtail a lot of the discriminating experiences that disabled people, young people at schools experience. And I think, again, we can see a failure in these kinds of policy responses as well. So in Scotland, some of the policies we have, which I'm sure you'll be familiar with, Getting It Right for Every Child, GERFEC, Fairer Scotland for disabled people, and the Disability Equality Plan more recently, are all the kind of blueprints for disability policy in Scotland. And in the school system, we have additional support language around support for disabled children focuses on additional support, whereas in England we would talk about special educational needs, the SEND system. And the kind of the gold standard is the coordinated support plan, and which one of our respondents, I always remember, said it's like finding a dinosaur egg, pretty rare in terms of availability and provision, but that's the support available through the education system. A bit of policy innovation as well. We have the ILF Transitions Fund, which has been important to so many young people, giving out small amounts of money to facilitate their independence and perhaps, you know, fund something that can make a difference in their day-to-day lives. And more recently, the National Transitions to Adult strategy for young disabled people coming out last year. And I should say our research was mainly conducted prior to the new strategy coming out, so it's not a judgment or comment at all on that at this stage. And in England, just to kind of compare some of the differences, we have a kind of more localized implementation of national strategies. So local areas tend to do their more things, but they're underpinned by the Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice. Slightly more interesting than than its wording, but that was implemented about 10 years ago, and that introduced the idea of the education, health and care plans, which are quite prominent in the news at the moment, just because the funding for that, the costs of that have really grown over the last few years, and governments of all complexions don't know how to fund it and to deal with it. So at the moment in England, we're seeing discussion which will eventually coalesce around a white paper in education. It's talking about SEND reform, which already has given more money to local authorities. There's been a lot of unhelpful discussion about provision for special educational needs, making local authorities very close to bankruptcy in some cases, the expense of that. Central government has to some extent provided more funds to local authority, and we're seeing discussion even the last few days, the development of inclusive spaces within schools, and having a more kind of inclusive space across the school sector. So every secondary school will be expected over the next decade to have inclusion bases in schools. But obviously this is a longer term plan. There is some extra money in there, but equally it's going to be slow, and we have a long-term questions over long-term commitment of legal duties in terms of the education, health and care plans, which I know a lot of parents and carers are particularly worried at the moment. So for both administrations in the UK and in Scotland, the provision within schools, the HCPs, the CSPs in Scotland, tend to be disproportionately allocated to more in affluent areas. I'm afraid it's a case where the kind of sharp elbows and middle classes faring much better, so not particularly targeting successfully those who need them, and certainly not as available as they should be. And also a failure of joining up policy, education, employment, the absence of social care reform, all these areas working in silos and without kind of joining up together. And that's really where we think transitions policy has got to be sorted out. So a push to increase the employment of disabled young people by governments, but I would argue without the kind of infrastructure, the structural change and the attitudinal change that's needed to help that, which is what we'll unpack through our research over the next short while. Okay, so just before I hand over to Jane, so just to really contextualise where our research sits. So the reason why we're doing this research is because there's been a real absence in the voices of disabled young people. Previous research was very narrow, and it tended to be more on a kind of rehabilitation, shift from children to adult services in health or social care, or special educational rehabilitation. So youth transitions research really ignored disabled voices. You weren't hearing about the experience of young disabled people, very little known about the group, and as I've said before, a real absence of longitudinal data. We don't know about how these experiences have panned out over the longer term. So that again returns to our idea of focusing on the impact of structural and attitudinal barriers. And with that, I'll hand over to Jane for the next part.
Okay, thank you very much. So I was the lead researcher for most of the project, doing the interviews in Scotland. I did have there was a researcher from the northeast of England who did the first round of interviews, and then I picked up on the second. So I have to say, over the 3 years of working in the project, it was a real privilege to speak to both disabled young people, parents and family members, as well as professionals. So a real rich experience in terms of both talking to people, but also what we've learned from people about their experiences. So I'm going to speak today about 4 of the key research themes. That there were other themes that came through the research, but given the work that ARC does, we thought that these were the 4 themes that would be most relevant for discussion today. But I would point you to our website, where there's a lot of information about what we found over the course of the 3 years. So just to identify the 4 themes, so the whole experience of transitioning from children to adult services, and that often being experienced as a cliff edge, that was one of the areas that, unsurprisingly, we found. The myth of inclusion, and that's speaking about the experience in the school, statutory school system. Then the experience of moving on further in higher education, and then opportunities for employment. So these are the 4 themes that I'm going to focus on over the next few minutes. So this idea of heading towards the cliff edge, there was a lot of work that had to happen in negotiating the transition for young people from children to adult services. And there were complexities around this in terms of different services recognizing different ages. For some services it's 16, for some it's 18. There are a number, depending on the complexity of the individual's needs, there may be a number of different stakeholders, statutory services involved. But as Charlotte was saying, these tend to work very much in silos. So trying to coordinate all the aspects of a young person's life, whether that be education, whether that be health, whether that be social care needs, each of those was complex, but trying to coordinate across different services and supports was very challenging. There was no one person who navigated that process. So a couple of quotes here from Lydia, a young person in England. She says, "It's very confusing because for some things I'm transitioning to adult services, for others I'm still in children's until I'm 19, so others would be 18. And then Sally, she was speaking very much about her experiences in the health system. And she says, suddenly you're being discharged from paediatric services and then having no resource to fill in the gaps or anybody to really go to. And what she and others spoke about was just the very different experience of paediatric care, which tended to be more generous in provision, but also very different in the style of delivery. And I think if you just think about what it's like to go into a children's hospital, which tends to be like bright and there's like beautiful murals, and then you go into a general hospital and it's very sort of institutional and pale green walls, that very much was reflected in the kind of service that people experienced. It's also a real transition from going to appointments with your parent, generally your mum, and having the healthcare professional speak to both of you, to then suddenly being only the person that the professional will speak to. And that was difficult for some people, particularly for people with more complex needs. And there were certainly examples of people saying, you know, the doctor is calling and they're insisting on speaking to my daughter, but my daughter doesn't have the ability to have that conversation on the phone. I have to mediate that, but they're not recognizing that. So many issues in that respect. And also in terms of this idea of heading towards a cliff edge is the idea of age restrictions. So certainly around accessing different services, particularly through third sector organisations, which are restricted based on their funding, is that often those services would stop at 25. So Kyle in England, he got a lot of support and connection and community from being involved in a community organisation. And at the age of 23, he was already worried about what it would be like when he reached the age of 25, when he wouldn't be able to be wasn't eligible anymore for their services. So he was worrying quite well ahead of time, and says, it's horrible. It's almost like, what do I do after that? There were also examples of, so I guess, you know, that cliff edge, it's both around the process of navigating different systems, but it's also around eligibility. And I think one of the most striking examples to me was a young woman who, up until the age of 18, was eligible to receive Botox injections for her legs. She is in a wheelchair, and the Botox really helped her manage her pain. But once she was an adult, she was no longer eligible for those injections. And so she was in more pain. You know, it's really, really sort of shocking. So that was, I'm just going to move along here. Sorry, my what I'm looking at looks quite different. So I'm just trying to find a way to, okay, right, just found the little slidey thing. Okay, so the second theme we wanted to speak about was the myth of inclusion. And this was about the sort of statutory educational experience for disabled young people. And we really were quite struck by how often school was described as sort of an unhappy experience. Certainly about 50%, at least 50% of the young people that we spoke to talked about bullying being, you know, really quite a defining feature of their experience in the school system, and a real lack of support from staff. There were a range of experiences, whether people were in the mainstream school system or whether they were in additional support for learning environments. Generally, people wanted, what we found was generally people wanted to be in the supported environments, and often parents, and again, primarily mums, had to do a lot of advocacy to try and get their child into the setting that was most comfortable for them. But even in those settings, we sometimes found that people didn't get the kind of support that you would have expected. It really felt at times that kind of specialized support was just not in place. So yeah, a real absence of individualized support, both through EHCPs in England, very few examples of coordinated support plans in Scotland. And we heard, and this example here from Sally is sort of one of the most shocking, really, that we heard, which is a real failure of equalities legislation around reasonable adjustments. So Sally, in her mid-teens, was dealing with a chronic health condition that meant that her body swelled. And so she recounts this experience of taking her exams. And she says, I couldn't wear my school uniform because I couldn't get my tights and my skirt on. So I was going around in leggings and t-shirts. They were really strict about uniform. My head teacher was like, you're not going into exams if you're dressed like that. So that's why I had to get my auntie over to dress me in the morning and take me to my exams. I mean, just, you can't really believe it. The ironic thing is that because she was given accommodation for the fact that she would need more time, so she wrote that exam in her school uniform in a room by herself. So the fact that she was required to wear a uniform is really quite shocking. Also found that there was, as I mentioned, a real lack of sort of understanding about individual needs, and particularly for those young people who were in mainstream environments, it was hard to find spaces that felt like inclusive and safe spaces. Anne-Marie, who was in the Scottish school system, she talked about the additional support for learning, which does bring together a whole range of different needs. She talks about all being lumped together. So she says, my school had one of those things where they just kind of lumped you all in additional support together. I initially got put in an English as a second language class until I eventually convinced them that actually my reading comprehension is pretty good. Now, the thing that was quite striking about this young woman is she's biracial, but she was born in Scotland. So she spoke English as her first language, but had been put into an English as a second language class. Kyle also speaks about this idea of like the building, the school building being one that wasn't one that kind of attended to his needs. He said it was a very restricted part of the school building that they were in. The staff, looked patronizing. I just never wanted to get help because of it. So although help was on offer, he didn't feel like the help reflected, it wasn't something he felt he could access. So yes, we found inconsistent and poorly targeted support. And then although there is a policy, a regulation in place around transitions planning, we found that it was really not consistent. And we found in the case some examples where people had had very poor transitions planning. And Mackenzie in Scotland was quite an extreme example of this. So he says, the person that was helping me either to find a job or go to college after school said I wasn't capable of doing anything. And my mum just took me out of school and I never went back. Really quite extreme example of a lack of support and a real sense of low expectations of people. Of disabled young people. And that was really quite a strong theme that we heard both from disabled young people and from family members. So in terms of looking at moving on, so further education, higher education, for many colleges offered stability and a kind of an environment where there was support, but it was sort of a calmer kind of space after what for many had been quite hostile. Now that it varied. For some people, college just wasn't the right environment, but for some, college and particularly supported programs were a good environment to be in. But we did find that courses were often unstimulating and sometimes just didn't match the kind of ambitions that people had. So Selena in England, she wanted to study art. She says, I didn't want to do computer studies, but at college they made me do computer studies because even if I said, no, can I please not do it? I asked them 3 times and they go, no, no, no. They'd push me. I have no energy to go and tell them I don't want to do this anymore. We also found in terms of that sense of kind of low expectations of people, when young people in the school system were looking at what their options were, there was a sense that for some young people, college or university just was not for them. This is a sort of an extended quote, but I think it's a really powerful one from Charlie in the Scottish school system. And he says, you had 2 types of teachers, those that were quite indirect and would just say, I don't know if hires are going to be for you. Why don't you stick to National 5? Or you would have teachers that were quite explicit. No, National 4 is for you because you've only got National 4s. National 5s might be quite hard for you. Because you've not got National 5, you can't go on and do hires. Because you've no hires, you won't be able to go to college, and don't even think about university because that really is a step too far. And I'm really happy to say that Charlie ignored that advice and is currently finishing a PhD. So, you know, the importance of being able to believe in yourself and have people around you who believe in you was yay, Charlie. It's just so important. And we found this, that people, when there were people that believed in them, whether they were social workers, healthcare workers, family members, friends, that's what people need. They need to be believed in and supported. We did speak to a number of young people who've been to university, and some had had good experiences, but we did hear of a number of examples where there really hadn't been enough reasonable adjustments put in place. And in some cases, there were barriers, unfortunately, from some of the staff that young people encountered. In terms of employment, now we did speak to people from the ages of 16 to 29. So for some people, employment wasn't yet what they were focused on. But we did find for those that were older, there were unfortunately not a lot of examples of people who had found sort of secure and sustainable employment. For many, it had been quite difficult to find employment. There have been a number of examples of different kinds of programs that people have gone to help them find employment. That really mixed success with some of those. There was one young person who had done a placement that was just really inappropriate based on this was a young person who was autistic, but he was put in a placement where he had a lot of sort of public facing responsibilities, and it was just never going to work for him. So that what could have been a really good opportunity ended up being an opportunity that made him feel that he had failed. So some evidence of adjustments being made, but minimal, and particular challenges for young people who are neurodivergent in terms of securing interviews and getting employed. We did hear some examples where there had been really good practice around providing interview questions, for example, ahead of time. And some employers are doing this for everybody. It doesn't matter if you identify as having a disability. Some employers see that as like a really positive way to prepare people to be able to do a good interview. So yeah, some good practice. Volunteering was really important. So Jasmine in England talked about what a huge difference it had made to her life, giving her a sense of connection and community. But yeah, again, we saw a few cases where this led to paid work. And Kickstart was one of the programs that a number of people had experienced, again, mixed outcomes. Some people had struggled with challenges around their benefits as a result of being in one of these programs. So those are the 4 key areas that we wanted to highlight today. And just to sort of wrapping up in terms of some discussion points here. So what we see is a real failure in policy. Often we have great policy, we have great regulations, that the challenge is in actually enacting the policy, ensuring that the policy is actually implemented. Again, the siloed responses in policy is an ongoing problem. And as Charlotte was referencing, the idea of so much now is focused on the individual. So individual disabled young people and families really have to play this role of being their own kind of social entrepreneur. So yeah, we really need to look at how is it that we embrace what legislation exists and make sure that it is implemented. Charlotte also referenced this in terms of the cost of the providing social care. There is a disincentive for local authorities in providing this because of the cost, and this is something that has to be addressed because the needs have to be addressed. And so the fact that there's this disincentive to support people in social care is a real policy dilemma. So we look to what's happening in Scotland with the new National Transition Strategy, which really has tried to tackle some of the policy silos. And so we shall see how that is actually implemented as we move forward. So much work to be done. So I hope that provided people with an overview of some of what we found from our research. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. There are no current questions in the Q&A or the chat, so I'm going to be asking some questions until people start putting them in the chat and the Q&A. So we've got kind of 15 minutes, I'd say, for any questions or anything that people might have. Because it's a big piece of research that you both carried out across Newcastle and Scotland. And Jane, you mentioned a few kind of solutions that people found useful. The first one was, I don't know, I'm trying not to use strong words, to be believed in and supported by people, like treated like an equal human. and the other one was employment questions in advance. Was there other things that were kind of coming out of the conversations that you had, or conversations with other people, that kind of started to surface some of these things that people just wanted more of?
So there were a number of areas of really good practice. I'm not sure this is what you're asking, but I think it's important to kind of highlight, especially given the audience that we have today. So there was one family a couple of families that I spoke to that had some very good experiences where the children, young people's team would work with the adult services team. So whether that's health, whether that was social work, so that the handover from that, to avoid that cliff edge, there really was a bridge that was built when the two teams worked together. So there was a real sense that, okay, I'm the person who's been working with this young person, you're the person who's going to be working with them now as an adult. These teams are going to meet with the family, with the young people. And so that handover will actually happen in a very personal, engaged way. There was another example, another family where the health provider who was going to be providing some specialist care, this was to someone with quite complex needs, had come to meet with the family before they took over the sort of managing kind of their case. That's not a good term, but they were the lead person. So, and I know that time is a huge constraint, but where people made that time and actually met with the family and met with the people who've been working with it. And often people who've been working, there was one situation where, again, this was speaking to a parent, their young person had quite a particular kind of health condition, and they had worked with the same health team throughout since the young person had been a baby, and they were about to hand over to the adult team. And there's also quite a lot of emotion in that. And I think for the health provider too, you've worked with this from a baby to this young person, and you're now sort of entrusting that person's care with someone else in the health system. So where that kind of handover transition can be managed collectively and thoughtfully in a way that involves the young person and the family, those were the really, really good examples where the transition had been managed really effectively.
Yeah, we find that a lot with what we do in the Scottish Transitions Forum too. It tends to be a bit of a lottery for people in terms of the person who is working with them, not so much the system. It's kind of in spite of the system. It's more there are good eggs there. Margaret, you've put in the chat stuff I don't understand, but I'll read it out in case people have missed. Lothian has had in-depth discussions with Alderhay and Sheffield, and we're working together to move forward. I'm assuming Alderhay and Sheffield is a local authority and a hospital. These aren't places that I am familiar with, but yeah, feel free to correct me, Margaret, if I'm just talking absolute nonsense.
Scott,
so,
can
yeah,
I just jump in
yeah,
on
sure.
your point about the individual? I mean, that's what we found, is it was always about the individual. So it's people who worked almost in spite of the system. So there was an example where a young person was going to be leaving school and they were getting into a day service, but there was a gap between the funding. And so the head teacher moved heaven on earth to extend, it was like just a few weeks, but to extend their enrollment in this high school, so then they could move seamlessly to the day service. So where there was someone who was willing to kind of push the boat out a bit, bend the rules a little bit, those were the transitions that were really effectively managed. So where people were able to put that kind of time into a transition process, we saw amazing results.
Yeah, and you were talking there about resources and people, and we know due to, I guess we just call them policy decisions and politics decisions, that funding for health and education and social work and social care are all really, really stretched. And when we speak to professionals in all of those different areas. It's one of the things that the resources are really thin on the ground is time, but also the budget for things too. But yeah, is there anything you think when you were doing the research you heard that could help people kind of manage their time? Sorry, that sounds a bit rude. Not that people need to manage their time better, but like people have less time and it needs to be more quality time. Was there anything that was coming through the conversations that kind of helped people in that regard at all? Or
I guess what I would say to that is, although it might have taken more time to have a smooth handover and like an informed handover, I think it's probably safe to say that by doing that, it actually saved a lot of problems down the road. So although it might take more time up front, it meant that transition was smooth, and therefore it would be much easier then for the social worker or whoever was then sort of responsible to be working with that family. There was also an example we spoke to somebody who was had been a pediatrician, and she talked about, this was one of the stakeholders we spoke to, and she talked about how useful it was with the Queen Elizabeth Hospital being kind of co-located next to Children's Hospital, so that professionals could we get to know each other. So I think where people know each other and have those relationships, so rather than it being, just a name on a piece of paper, it's like, oh no, I know John, I can talk to him, I'll see him in the cafeteria next week, we can chat about this. So there was a sense of where there are those relationships exist, that those were really, that kind of social glue was really important. So all about relationships. It's always about relationships.
Yeah. Yeah, we find that across the piece, that when people know each other and know the environment that they're in, for instance, like education or social work or health, know the different organizations and people that are around them that can take on board different things, the transition again is a lot smoother. And when teams are co-located, I know that there's work ongoing in different local authority areas in Scotland to look at different ways of building teams around that kind of idea of co-location, not just in a physical sense, but also in a temporal sense as well, because we know that there's that dimension to the transition element too. Just turning my attention to the chat for a moment. Actually, before I do that, Charlotte, do you have anything to add? I see you nodding. Feels rude not to bring you in, sorry.
No. I'm happy to let Jane talk about the aspect. I was just looking at the questions there around employment. I'm happy to have a go on.
Yeah, go for it. Do you want to read
just seeing from Vicky and Lisa in the chat have raised, about just, again, you'd see this as a reasonable adjustment, like in interviews, giving people interview questions in advance of the interview. And like, the example Jane gave in the presentation about the girl who was made to wear a school uniform, there's things that can be done that aren't a huge resource implication, like, employers can give out or could give out interview questions before young people are attending interviews. And there's so much more that can be done in that area, because it is something that it's a cultural change. We talked about structural change, but also sort of attitudinal change, and making it normal that you would give out questions before someone comes to interview. So, so it's not like a big exam, it's kind of a proper dialogue and conversation. So, yeah.
Yeah, some of the young people that have the privilege of working alongside talk about those questions in advance. And I noticed that someone says they do share questions before the interview as standard, although it's on the day of the interview. One of them finds that, Lisa, really unhelpful, because they need time to think through the questions in a way that's not, okay, here's the questions in advance, and yeah, we're doing what we probably should do, but also it's then more terrifying for that person, of that, like, oh my gosh, here they are. And yeah, she's a bit of a haver as well. So yeah, I appreciate that. So I also, the fact that lots of people treat interviews as adversarial is a real barrier. It's kind of, almost like prove to me why you should get this job, rather than like trying to bring out the best of that person for that interview. And it's, as you say, it's a culture change, a massive culture change that's required around employability. Lisa saying they share them for everybody. I also found it unhelpful. Yeah, and that kind of, yeah, it's like we'll treat everyone the same, which is great, but also there's not much thought put into the time pressure of having those questions just half an hour before an interview. That's, yeah. And Margaret saying it's all coming down to money. It is coming down to money. There are people that we talk to that say that finances breed culture and culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's a phrase that I've heard quite often, and I think it's something that we can all kind of relate to, you know, because the practice follows the money a little bit too much, actually. So I've got other questions for you, Charlotte. We could just sit all afternoon, because your research is massive, and I do encourage people to go to the websites that's been shared in the chat, because there's loads to it, and there's lots of policy input that you've been doing. So for the people who are in this webinar pool, how would you want them to utilize the research that you've created? What can they kind of, what's the best way in for people to kind of bring what you're talking to life?
I certainly would encourage people to look at the website. We did quite a number of policy briefings, so we've really, in this project, we've really tried to focus on applying the learnings. So in a language that is accessible for people. I think one of the briefings that we produced was about good practice. So some of what we've shared today and other examples are in that policy briefing. We did one both from Scotland and from England, so that might be a particularly helpful briefing for people to look at. And I think the thing is, because there are a number of examples of where there is good practice, and as Charlotte said, sometimes it doesn't necessarily take a huge resource to do things differently. And so those sorts of lessons that we learned, or learnings from what we heard from people, I think are quite encouraging, because there are lots of good things in the system, and there's a lot of very good people trying to do this work well, despite the constraints of the system. So I think coming from a position of assuming the best and really encouraging people to take the time to sort of develop those relationships and connections, all of that. It's like an investment in process. The more that different statutory partners can work with other statutory partners to really think about that transition process. And I do get that the sort of the constraints must be very real and very difficult, but we certainly saw a number of examples where where those constraints were overcome and some really good results happened.
Yeah, so that's reassuring. I think when systems are under a lot of stress, it's kind of like, if you start to view jobs as kind of the trauma that they experience, they tend to revert to the systems and checklists and things, because that's where it's safe, and that's what they have to do, rather than that kind of wider work. And I think it's something, the pressure across health, social care and education and the third sector is huge at the moment, and people are retreating down into a system that doesn't support actually more relationship-based practice. There's a question from Hannah in the chat. I'll just read it out. We support a lot of autistic young people who understandably feel unable to leave the house due to high anxiety, past negative experiences. This affects their ability to move into volunteering, college, etc. Did any participants mention this or suggest what helped them overcome this? We sometimes feel time and patience is a healer, but I would love to hear any other suggestions. So Jane, Charlotte, do you have any?
I remember one of the initiatives that we heard about was doing just focusing on areas where there is anxiety and real stress. So one of the services that was on offer to some of the young people we spoke to was having transport experiences. So for example, teaching a young person how to use the local bus. So it would just be a case of a trainer working with a young person maybe twice a week for a number of weeks, however long it took, to get them really familiar with using that bus service, just their local bus service. And just very small changes in their lives like that could have such a huge difference. And as you said, I think in the chat, it's like having that time and patience with that person to say, it's okay, this is how we do it, and it will take as long as we need to, and hopefully, you know, that will make a big change. And certainly experiences we've had, small initiatives like that, not hugely costly interventions, were really positive. Jane, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add to that, the bus pass is like the most amazing thing for people. So there was one young person I spoke to who's exactly as was described by the person who posed the question, somebody who's autistic, who really doesn't go out very much, really has struggled in education and employment, did not get his diagnosis until he was 26, at which point he was no longer eligible for any of the kind of programs that end at 25. But he said the most amazing thing about having the diagnosis was, one, he'd always known he was autistic, and it was validating to get that diagnosis. But he said the bus pass, that enables him, because he's a carer for his mum, so he goes out, he gets the shopping. So that has been really, really important for him. So really important for disabled people to have that access, for those that can obviously manage being on buses. But I think eligibility of programs beyond the age of 25 is really important, because we did find, and this is a real area of positivity and hope, is the kind of supports that are provided by third sector, community-based organisation, disabled people's organisations. They were one of the most consistently positive things that we heard about from people. So whether that's an online space, that there's a group online, people meet fellow disabled people, fellow queer disabled people online, those spaces are really important. Yeah, so ditch the 25 age. I mean, that would be a fairly easy thing to do, and recognise that people need beyond that time to connect with others.
Yeah, I totally hear that with the people that I know too, that it takes them longer. I'd love to speak actually about the use of online places as a third space for young disabled people, because it's a huge thing that a lot of the young people would, but we're kind of running out of time for the webinar. I will have the final question to Margaret. This might be a yes or a no answer. Did you look at the costs associated with individual transition?
That wasn't, yeah, that we didn't look at that. I mean, you're talking about actual financial cost, like a kind of a analysis of cost. No, that wasn't it. It was very much qualitative research that we undertook.
That answers the question, Margaret, but it is something that the Scottish Transitions Forum are taking back to